Hi, and welcome back after our fantastic lunch plenary. I'm sure you all came out of there hungry. Let's now get on to our next presentation, which is a heritage of resilience, design, craft, and gardening through Caribbean lenses. And we welcome today Camila, Diana, and Michelle, who will talk to us for the next few minutes in this pre-recorded session, and then you'll have the time for a live Q&A. So over to you now, the recording.
Good afternoon, participants in the Museums Association of the Caribbean edition 2021. We are here talking today about a heritage of resilience, design, craft, and gardening through Caribbean lens. My name is Dr. Diana Bearden-Jai. I'm a senior curator and cultural specialist at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian. I am joined by my fellow panelists, Dr. Michelle Joan Wilkinson, museum curator, Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Ms. Camila Bryce-Laporte, an independent folklorist allied with the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance and the convener of a series of programs called Grandma's Gardens and Healing Health, and also researching the connection between agriculture, gardening, and African and Caribbean craft and food. So our title, The Heritage of Resilience, Design, Craft, and Gardening Through Caribbean Lens. What does resilience and sustainability mean for institutions, individuals, and communities that have been subjected to repetitive trauma and degradation? How do design, craft, and gardening illustrate these concepts in African American and Caribbean contexts? We're going, starting with Dr. Michelle, we're going to contextualize these questions and offer examples from contemporary experience of museums, makers, artists, and the documentation of women's long-held agricultural practices in the diaspora. What we will also discuss some of the drawbacks, the invisibility, and the dissipation embedded in the history and application of these terms and practices. I'm going to start by asking Dr. Michelle Wilkinson to introduce herself and her topic, Design for Resilience. Thank you, Michelle.
So as Diana mentioned, I'm a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I actually will talk a little bit about that as related to resilience. So I'm going to just jump right into my presentation. Where did the word originate and what are its associations? Resilience has been in the English language since the 1600s. It was used in the 1800s in reference to engineering and material science. For example, shipbuilding and watchmaking were two industries in which the word was used. In the 20th century, concepts of psychological resilience were applied to people, particularly with research on the resilience of children in the 1970s. Today, the term is used in various circles, from business to military to museums to the natural and built environment. Consider disaster resilience, emotional resilience, risk and resilience, sustainability and resilience. But the but the most basic definitions refer to resilience as the ability for something or someone to return to form after a traumatic event. The word derives from resiliere in French and Latin, meaning to recoil or to rebound, that is to bounce back or spring back into shape. Broadly, resilience describes one's ability to recover fairly well from adversity. Museums, and there's going to be some images of art in here. I've tried to list the artists. Museums have seized upon the concept of resilience in a variety of ways. The theme for the 2021 annual meeting of the American Alliance of Museums was Resilient Together. Our conference highlights cultivating resilience in museums and cultural heritage sites. In these scenarios, resilience may imply museums doing the work to remain relevant and to sustain themselves in a not-for-profit landscape. Resilience may also relate to the perseverance and resoluteness of the communities many of our museums document and preserve. These communities, whether of African descent, indigenous, or of national and cultural identities, encompass people who, despite the immense challenges they face, have continued to tell their own stories through song, dance, craft, culture, literature, cuisine, some of the things we'll explore today. As a museum worker in a museum in which resilience has been a key narrative thread, I wanted to maintain a sort of critical perspective towards the term and the ideas it conveys. And I want others to do so as well. So, how is resilience used at the National Museum of African American History and Culture? From its inception, the word resilience appears in promotional materials that would describe the yet-to-be-built museum. Prior to opening, the museum expressed that, quote, African Americans have exemplified a resilient spirit that is also fundamentally American. In those days prior to opening, the positioning of resilience was within the American grain. It was discussed as a shared American value that became a defining element of the African American experience. Resilience is also used to describe the conceptual design elements of the museum building, which you see here. Our press packet explains, quote, as the outer layer of the building, the corona, that three-tiered form, draws on imagery from both African and American history, reaching toward the sky in an expression of faith, hope, and resiliency. Resilience is also a major thread in our exhibition titled Making a Way Out of No Way. Our website tells you that the stories presented in Making a Way reflect the perseverance, resourcefulness, and resilience required of African Americans not only to survive, but to thrive in America despite tremendous obstacles. Resilience is used in the many speeches and presentations we curators give to convey the unshakable faith, the indomitable hope of African Americans. And I too am among those who've used the term, but I'm also haunted by a question. What if we aren't always resilient? Or more like it, what if we tire of being resilient? How does our history of resilience impact our present and future? I understand why we praise resilience. What other options existed in the face of terror? The inescapable terror of capture, confinement, enslavement, degradation, the terror of rape, beating, lynching, murder, the ongoing terror of walking while Black, sleeping while Black, driving while Black, trying to live while Black. I've reasoned that resilience, the resilience we speak about at the museum, is a learned behavior, a learned process of making a way out of no way. Suggesting a fortitude to withstand and to survive, resilience communicates the ability to absorb and surmount the most oppressive circumstances. Perhaps this is why it's a hard word for me and it unsettles me. It triggers a series of ideas and images of what Black people specifically have had to bounce back from. And I realized I was not alone in my thinking about this. In 2015, when I had to interview a few influential Black thinkers for some content and development at the museum, I asked one of the interviewees to complete the sentence, quote, African American history and culture has taught me, and then an ellipsis. And I asked several people, in fact, and one woman responded, African American history and culture has taught me that Black people are very resilient. I mean, we're a history of resilient people. And at some point, it's like, let's stop being resilient. I don't want to be oh so resilient. I want to be like they fought and then the battle was won and the people could stop being resilient and move on into victory. My interviewee ended with, I think that, resilience has been key in the history of Black people in this country. But the last words I really heard were, and then the battle was won and the people could stop being resilient and just move on into victory. For me, that was a beautiful sentiment, and it was haunting, and it still is. Considering that resilience had been our history, did the need for resilience have to define the future? What does a future look like in which Black people could just be? So there are many types of resilience, and for the remainder of the talk, I'd like to explore how those of us whose work is broadly in fields where the term is frequently used, whether that's museums in general, Caribbean populations, African American populations specifically, or design and building practices, which I'm very interested in. I want us to re-examine what we mean, and most importantly, who we imagine when we say resilient. Resilience in design. One moment. Resilience in design. Resilience is a benchmark in the design and building industries. Resilience is a sought-after goal for places prone to the impacts of natural disasters. It is applicable to varied scales, from a structure's resilience to climate resiliency, where extreme heat or catastrophic flooding need to be mitigated. So we have resilient design, right? Thinking about from the scale of an individual object up through infrastructure. Resilient communities at the level of people with kind of a loose association to geographic or some other affiliation. Resilient cities at the level of place or locale, and also the notion of city as a large human settlement. Resilient coastlines, which is a particular issue for island nations where shores can become porous and vulnerable, yielding vulnerable populations. And even resilient futures, this idea of a shared, global, interconnected, and interdependent future. But how do we get there from the present in which power and access is uneven? As a curator of architecture and design, I find the discourses on resilience from these specific fields particularly provocative. Architect Jermaine Barnes takes both a critical and affirmative view on cultivating resilience in Miami. He talks about at the University of Miami, where they focus on resilience because it's a city, on the water. But he says, the way I identify resilience and teach resilience and practice around resilience is social resilience, not necessarily infrastructure and climate. For me, it's how we deal with the stratification of race and ethnicity in the built environment. And how are the ways in which our rituals, our cultural histories and legacies are either promoted or stifled because of architecture, infrastructure, and urban planning, end quote. And here he's talking a lot about the battle for higher ground in Miami, who lived where and who has to move now as land is, people are seeking higher ground with Miami's sea level issues. So as the battle for land on higher ground in Miami reveals, the politics of location, who can live by the water, and the politics of identity, who can't live by the water, are historically intertwined. Quote, When we talk about resilience, it's more than just how high will the water rise, Barnes says. It's also about who we are taking advantage of and who we are protecting within the built environment. And he says that he teaches a class on criminal architecture, and he talks about all the ways in which people of color have been harmed by, urban infrastructures. And he says at the end, I teach this to help students understand the ways in which the human body needs to be resilient within these larger infrastructures, or else we perish, right? So resilience happens in service of self-preservation. And this idea brings to mind the words of Caribbean American writer Audre Lorde on self-care as an act of self-preservation and political warfare. Tactically speaking, resilience is cultivated, right? Writing, gardening, laughing, loving, all of these are embedded in cultivating resilience. And so we can plot what resilience looks like in psychology or in design, but to personalize it a bit more, I want to sort of move towards a conclusion thinking about some of these questions. What does resilience mean to me as a Black American and Caribbean American woman? What does it mean for Caribbean populations? What does it mean for anyone who is regularly expected to or asked to be resilient? And how does resilience relate to memory? So as a Caribbean American woman, one of the things I think about, and as a Black woman, is this kind of myth of resilience being related to the strong Black woman, right? And there was a skit on Trevor Noah where they had an Encyclopedia Blacktanica, excuse me, and they turned to the page with strong Black women, and the definition is noun, mythical Black woman who is, the first word, resilient, selfless, and needs zero help. So already we see that this is really a damaging perception because, as many of us know, many times we do need help. So it's no wonder that Black women have been among the most outspoken against resilience. And that was actually a hashtag by Kaguro on Twitter, against resilience. And this sort of references, again, the myth of the superwoman. What does resilience mean for Caribbean populations? Right? So I've mentioned resilience in the context of this Museum Association gathering and crafting and cultivating resilience, but there are also more typical proposals around resilience. And this is one that, as I was researching, I came across related to USAID and aid to the Caribbean to prevent the stronger impacts of natural disasters. So the idea that, again, this natural disaster, which of course are also related to man-made issues, right, that these are ways that the Caribbean is shoring itself up against impacts and becoming more resilient. But I thought it was so interesting that if you look at the last line here, that this building of resilience is also part of this path or journey to self-reliance, right? And so what does that really sort of indicate? What are the subtexts right there? Another question then, who is regularly asked or expected to be resilient? And for that, I'll leave it open. I hope that those of you who are listening can think about who you imagine. I kind of visualized it a little bit, but who is regularly expected or asked to be resilient? This is another work of art by Sanford Biggers that I feel like powerfully speaks to these questions. And then how does resilience relate to memory? And I thought here of Guyanese British poet Grace Nichols and her volume, and particularly that line, I is a long-memoried woman. So does resilience mean that you remember so as not to repeat, or that you forget so as not to relive, right? So to conclude, an article in Harvard Business Review titled The Dark Side of Resilience opines that too much resilience could make people overly tolerant of adversity. And so for groups suffering from inequities, resilience is needed, but should not go unchecked, right? In architecture, the implication of resilience is that if a structure sustains trauma, the damage, if any, is not permanent nor irreparable. So it's kind of like that old Timex commercial where the watch takes a licking but keeps on ticking. And so the questions are really, are humans built that way? Are there limits to what we can sustain? I would say yes. And so I think I'm going to just sort of wrap up here, but I will say that, our museums engage stories about people who are resilient, about communities who are resilient. And it's important that we document individuals, communities, and these traditions that have persevered. And those of us who do have this heritage of resilience, we have a lot to be proud of. But we also need to see resilience not only as a point of pride, but also to recognize the expectations of resilience are disproportionately placed on some. Who is expected to be resilient? Who benefits from it? How? And who is designed for resilience? Who has to cultivate it and why? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This was an excellent context for our conversation, and especially in this year, or these few years now, I guess, where COVID means that many of the frontline workers, I know in the United States, who are part of the Caribbean diaspora, are being called upon to be resilient in the extreme. I think this is very important, and also as many of our Caribbean islands and countries are confronting climate change as well, and a lot of the burden in terms of rebuilding falls on people disproportionately. I think that this is very, very relevant. And it's also a great segue. Next, we are going to hear from Camila Bryce-Laporte, who has done some incredible research on the story of Black women in rice and on the agricultural heritage and resilience and the implications for that. So Camila, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and also to share your screen. Thank you.
Before I begin, I wanted to describe this work in the context of an organization that we formed. It grew out of work that I was doing with local farmers in Southern Maryland. And it seemed they were interested in, it's called Ujima Farmers Cooperative Alliance. And they were interested in returning people to the soil and in bringing back to Black communities and indigenous communities historically significant plants and food. And given my background in folklore, I thought one of the most effective ways to do that was to collect the stories from women who are farming or who originated from agricultural families. I'm sorry, the sun is shifting, so you're gonna see different shadows. Is this better for you? Is this better? Okay, so I'm gonna start with a quick description. We call this the group, the storytelling group was called Grandmother's Garden. This isn't the first one. And a quick description: for centuries, Black women in the Americas were the helm of the New World culinary evolution. In the beginning of the colonial period, they were critically involved in all aspects of food, planting, cultivating, distribution, and consumption, particularly in the Americas. They created a new culinary expression that combined African, colonial, and indigenous foodways and traditions. That led to a new cuisine for a new creolized population. Black women were not only important chefs and agriculturalists, but well-regarded ethnobotanists and healers. They became proficient at identifying and creating remedies using both local vegetation and transported African plants. During the colonial period, Black women's knowledge of food and the natural world were important social commodities. They used these skills as nurses, midwives, cooks, spiritual leaders, and that served both African or Black and white communities. This knowledge spoke to their resilience, again, their intelligence, and their ability to retaliate when provoked. After emancipation, women used this knowledge to build businesses and sustain their families and communities. Unfortunately, that knowledge is dissipated in large part because of its connection to our traumatic history. Black populations are becoming increasingly dependent on systems that don't necessarily support them, they are also losing the impulse to care for themselves. Grandma's Garden is our attempt to reverse that trend. I coordinate and facilitate Grandma's Garden in partnership with Haria Danfodio, a master gardener and health educator in St. Croix, Virgin Islands. Once or twice a month, Grandma's Garden provides a forum for Black and Indigenous women to share their food, medicinal, and spiritual experiences. Grandma's Garden is designed to celebrate women's resilience, again, that word, preserve their culinary traditions, their plant knowledge, and most importantly, relieve their mutual pain. The information collected is shared with the Ujima Cooperative Farming Alliance, an organization dedicated to collecting, preserving culturally important plants, culinary, and agricultural traditions. Additionally, our participants provide creative modalities for healing. For this MAX session, we plan to discuss the work of Grandma's Garden in collaboration with the Ujima farmers. And more importantly, I'm going to start with the story of rice. What I attempt to do is to provide, I call historical and cultural resources, and I condense them and I send them to the group. So my objective is not only to provide them with the initial information, but to allow them to do the research themselves. And all of our discussions, with Haria's help, we know that these discussions trigger traumatic experience, either during, before, or after. And we begin each session with prayer, ecumenical prayer, generally led by one of our Muslim sisters, as a matter of fact, and with the healing. Initially, it's a meditation, and it centers on our womb. We breathe into the womb because it's from the womb that our trauma and birth are transmitted. And Haria leads that part as a health and womb educator. So our story today will, as in the past month, has been dealing with rice, the cultivation of rice. There are two forms of rice that exist in the world. Orisa sativa, which is an Asian rice, and Orisa glaberrima, an African rice. This rice was cultivated in the inland delta of the upper Niger River, what is today Mali, about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Glaberrina was selected for several different localities within vast forests and savanna regions. Its wild ancestor, Oryza bartheli, grew and was harvested by ancient hunting and gathering human populations. It was Black women, particularly the Jola, that were responsible for the development of Oryza glaberrina. The African rice, as you can see, is different from the Asian rice. By comparison, it's pear-shaped, it's red-branded, it has black seed coat, straight panicles, and it's longer. But I mean, it's shorter. It's actually shorter and more fragile than the Asian varieties that you see at the bottom. when the Jola women are essential to, the women are essential to the cultivation of rice. It is said that female labor is central to the cultivation of rice throughout Africa. In Casamas, they refer to it as women's sweat. And when a woman dies, to show her connection to the activity of food processing, her mortar and pestle is placed at her grave. In the when the Portuguese first arrived, the Portuguese of the Europeans, they were the first to observe the extent of the rice cultivation in West Africa. In 1590s, André Alvarez Almada, who was born in Cabo Verde, he's of mixed European and African heritage and a well-seasoned traveler. He wrote that in these parts, the rainy season starts at the end of April and the beginning of May. Blacks make their fields into these plains. They construct dikes of earth for fear of the tides, but despite the tides, the dikes, the river breaks them frequently and the rice floods the fields. Once the rice is sprouted, they pull it out and transplant it onto land that is less inundated. This is where when the rice yields. Although Alamada seemed confused about the practicing of rice transplanting, which is done in deeper water and rather than well-drained water, he provides ample evidence that the natives of those areas were growing swamp and wetlands in dike fields using intensive techniques. And that was written by Olga Linares. In the 15th century, when the rest of Europe was decimated by the Black Plague, the Portuguese were well on their way as mariners and using the maritime weaponry and calculations that they acquired from the Muslims. The Portuguese traveled through the west coast of Africa, and there they encountered well-established governments and social organizations, many of them more organized than what they would find in Europe. They found that they were not only larger, but more hygienic and better organized. Additionally, the Portuguese shared some of the same religious traditions and folk beliefs as the West Africans they encountered. In 1444, a group of 235 people were abducted by the Portuguese and brought to Europe. They arrived in Lagos, in southern Portugal. This was the historic benchmark, they believe, for the transition, the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. The Portuguese, until they would continue this trade throughout the late 1800s. There's estimated that there were 400,000 enslaved people that entered Portugal. By the 16th century, 10% of Lisbon's population was Black. By the 17th and 18th century, that Blacks constituted 15% of their population. And there's strong evidence that Black people were responsible for cultivating rice in the Sado and Tugas rivers. They brought with them, the Africans spearheaded the transformation of these marshlands into productive rice fields. The Portuguese were also responsible for bringing 4 million Africans to Brazil. These women, largely women, I'm going to skip to this picture so that you can see. Sorry for the the women were charged, the rice arrived in hulls. So they were largely seeds, and the women were responsible for pounding the rice and providing nutrition for the people on board. And we're going to go back. There is folklore in Brazil and in Suriname, which says that the women took the seeds and planted it in their hair. They didn't know where they were going to go, but they knew that their primary objective was to feed themselves and their children. Within, along the American coast, there are several maroon communities. And in Brazil and in Suriname, and certainly around the American Carolinas, they found evidence of this rice being grown on the outskirts of plantations and within the maroon communities. The Quilibos in Brazil, and also the independent maroon communities in Suriname and French Guiana. As in West Africa, the women are the principal cultivators of these plants. Recently, there was a study done in Suriname and French Guiana, and among the Maroons who had up to 36 varieties of rice. And among them, that rice included Oryza sativa, which is the Asian rice, and Oryza glaberrima, which is the African rice. The rice, which is very fragile, instead of being eaten, is offered to it's used in, now used in religious practices. It's offered to the ancestors, and it's used in herbal baths, to remedy illnesses. This same rice was brought to the United States mainland. They date it back to 1648. And it's actually first cultivated in Virginia, but it competed with tobacco, which was the major cash crop. There's evidence that it was used in stews and soups, that it was prepared both for slaves and both for the enslaved and for the plantation owners or masters. Well, where it took off was in the Carolinas. The Carolinas, North and South Carolina, and through in the Gullah territory from the Carolinas to Florida, you found there developed something called Carolina gold. Carolina gold is actually a combination of glaberrina and sativa. It was cultivated in hard marshlands. These people were subject to really difficult circumstances. They managed to create a dike system through the mangroves, but the work was laborious, and they were often confronted with yellow fever and malaria. But the cultivation, I'm sorry, I got lost in my words, my apologies. But because it was so economical and so profitable, it was worth, there were several of the population died as a result of, working on this rice. But because the rice was so profitable, they continued, and it became the most profitable and award-winning rice throughout the Americas and throughout the world. It became the rice to cultivate. After the War of during the War of 1812, the English promised the the Gullahs and those Sea Island people freedom if they would serve with them against the Americans. The English were stretched at that point. They were fighting several battles and they needed the man support. The Americans, as they're known in Trinidad, would fight with the British against the Americans. They would also fight in the Caribbean. And after suing the British, they were able to acquire their own land. And that land was acquired in Trinidad and Tobago. They brought with them many of their traditions, including this Glabarina rice, which now exists in Trinidad. There was whole cultures built around this rice. And with the support of the local indigenous population, the rice has transformed into another form of Glabarina. The rice was also returned. Carolina gold was also transported back to Africa. It's among the first grains it's brought by the returning Africans to Liberia and to West Africa. It's believed that the slave ship that returned Cinque to his homeland also had some of the first cargo of Glabarina rice. Here's the dilemma. The dilemma is that due to climate change, we are losing this rice. The rice is also being replaced by the sativa varieties because they grow faster, they are sturdier, and they hold up in cultivation better and in the milling process better. But with the loss of those varieties, we're also losing an ability to feed our own children. And not only that, we're losing track of our own heritage. So what could we do to support? One of the major things we can do is to support small farmers and small businesses. Moringa rice is out of Trinidad. Fonio is out of West Africa. It's being produced by a Senegalese chef based here in New York. By these packages support not only those businesses, but the small farmers that are associated with them. And also there's small farmers, even in New York, returning to the field. This is a Jola farmer and his wife who are now cultivating Glabarina rice in New York. But I think Michael Twitty puts it best. Culinary justice is when our children have access to the land, traditional ecosystems, resources. I can't see the rest. Hold on, excuse me. Culinary justice is when children of color have access to the land, traditional ecosystem, resources, clean water, and legal protections by which they can grow the heirlooms and raise the heritage breeds of their ancestor. And do so in a way that they might come back to the greater connection with nature and learn to eat and live better. They will become entrepreneurs, producers, and providers of products unique to their cultural heritage, and in the process, lift communities out of poverty and create greater opportunity. That's from his book, A People's History of Carolina Rice. If you ever wonder where that Sunday tradition of serving rice and peas comes from, it is part of our own legacy. It is born of the Akan. And it's important for us to remember this, not only for ourselves, but also for our children.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Camila. This has been a wonderful session, and we've dealt not only with the concepts relating to resilience, but also an example of resilience and the dangers of relying on concepts of resilience within not only our discourse and our but also in our practice, and some of the maybe some of the limitations of resilience. Our session is almost done. We have just a few minutes, and in the few minutes, I just wanted to speak for maybe 5 minutes about an effort at the Smithsonian, at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where I work, looking at fostering resilience, and fostering the resilience specifically of craft. And when we talk about the term makers, and I'm going to put on I'm going to share my screen for a second. Okay, can everyone see that? Great. When we talk about makers, the term generally applies to people who engage with materials to produce objects. And the making tent is intentionally big. It includes artists who express personal visions through traditional craft media, artisans who create objects for use by clients and customers, and hobbyists who create for personal use, including gifting to others. It's a very long tradition. Makers of African descent are actively creating, but their stories and lives are barely visible in the public eye. And this is ironic, given the immense role of enslaved Africans in the building of America, and of course in the Caribbean as well, and the ongoing involvement of Black people in the making today. And there have been many efforts, as I mentioned, to focus on understanding and keeping traditions going, both individual efforts by people who teach, many times mothers who teach their children needlework skills, and fathers who teach their kids carpentry skills, and now in the present day, crafts are, whether it be traditionally gender-based crafts, are actually crossing genders in terms of people learning these skills. So I'm going to focus just for a minute on the African American Craft Initiative, which builds on the legacy of a conference that took place in 1979. And it was in Memphis, Tennessee, and it sought to expand the visibility, as our project does, of African American artists and makers, highlighting the importance of their practices. And we see that through our research, we found that not only is African American craft resilient, but it has an essential role in the social and spiritual economic survival of the United States. And through this, we've hosted several online summits in which both Michelle and Camila have participated. And these summits, as well as a think tank, generated recommendations for the continuation of the making traditions. And what we realize is that through the think tank and the makers sessions, that while people are still engaging in traditions, whether they be agricultural traditions, whether they be traditions that involve using materials, they've been pretty much invisible. And the key to keeping these going is not only passing these traditions down to others, but also the documentation of these traditions. And so our call to the museum community is to make sure that we continue to bring these traditions into public view, to record, to archive, to create both visual and written opportunities, exhibitions for makers. And we can see that throughout the Caribbean, this is both in the Caribbean and in the United States, there are many opportunities to include this. Some of the problems, maybe lack of understanding of culture-based aesthetics in some institutions. We know that hair styling is also a tradition. The belated recognition of the devastating effects of systemic racism and state-sanctioned violence in the United States, especially. And as I said, the invisibility of individual creators. So what we're calling for is the improved and increased research and documentation of African-American and Caribbean makers and their crafts, new and renewed networks linking African-American makers to each other and to support organizations, and connections between the African world, which includes not only the United States, but the Caribbean, South America, and the African continent as well, and increased public awareness of not only African-American craft, but also craft throughout the diaspora and so on. And so this is a very quick survey of how museums can make efforts to help sustain the visibility and the continuation of making throughout the Caribbean and throughout the African world. So we've actually gone through 3 different presentations, and we conclude by noting the importance of the concept, the importance of the practice, and the efforts to, as museum professionals, to sustain these very important aspects of our cultural and historical life. So we want to move now to thank the Museums Association of the Caribbean, and also say that we are opening up to our question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ladies. I think we might have lots of questions there, because you said so much, but you really brought us back lots of things that I think have people thinking. So there may be some questions there for you. Let's go on to the live question and answers.
Okay. Thank you so much. This has been Ms. Garcia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. And of course, Camila and Michelle. And we did have one question to open up, which was someone mentioned great presentations. However, I missed where Camila shared where the rice is being cultivated. And is Grandma's Garden an actual site for rice cultivation?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the rice is being cultivated in Trinidad, and it's very expensive because it's a small production, but I would suggest that everyone try to get a bag. I'll try to hold one up. It's also being cultivated in Suriname and also in West Africa. And I believe there's a Center for African Rice. I may have the name incorrect, where they're doing further studies on it because they realize that it has great medicinal and dietary properties. So I would take a look in those places. And they've discovered remnants of it actually in Louisiana. And there is a show called Nourished, produced by PBS, and they have a segment on rice. And I recommend that you all take a look at it.
If I can take a plug in there as a Trini myself.
Yes.
The Moruga Hill rice,
Yes.
distinctively red,
Yes.
is only found in Trinidad.
There, right, but there are varieties. It's
Oh, yes, there are lots of other varieties. But the history behind that rice is absolutely fantastic.
That's right.
Okay, let's continue.
And we should give the Trinis an applause for for getting it on the market. You can get it through Walmart online, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So yes, and it's delicious, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Cook it in some coconut milk, put lots of herbs in it.
That's right. And you're good to go.
And some okras.
And some okras. And Brazil has a form of it as well. They call it, I think they also call it red rice.
You're making all of us hungry right now.
Okay, there's another question for you. Is Grandma's Garden a physical organization?
Grandma's Garden is virtual. You're welcome to join. Anybody with a good story is welcome to join. We've been on hiatus for a minute, but we'll leave the information and we come up with topics. We'll continue with rice for our next one, and we're getting ready to do our programming for next year. And Miss Michelle, your whole topic on resilience, that was so moving. We want you to do a whole thing on resilience and Black women. So it's a wonderful discussion of old and young. One of our very first speakers was a woman from Trinidad who talked about healing methods that her grandparents employed, and her yard, her grandfather's yard. It was amazing, amazing.
Well, Michelle, that is true. I ditto, and I really was thinking a lot about what you said about, when do we have to stop? When are we going to stop having to be so resilient? And there's a phrase which I'm sure you know from Guyana: hand wash hand, make hand clean. And and in your experience and in your work, especially with museums, have you thought of ways that as museum professionals, Caribbean museum professionals and so on, there are ways that we can contribute to helping each other's museums become resilient, or to spread the message of these resources and this history of resilience?
Right. I got bumped out for a while, so I hope I'm actually back and that you all can hear me. So I think we're doing that right now with this conversation, having the conversation within a group of museum professionals within the Caribbean and its diaspora, and thinking through, strategies for sort of like sharing, the lifting and sharing all of our work. In some ways, I think the institutions and museums that have kind of been through a lot of this before, we've learned, as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we're still sort of the new kid on the block, but we've learned, the museum work from people that have been in the profession. And so a lot of the, I think, good things that we've employed have been tested and proven out there. And thinking about, MAC as the network, I see the role of the organization to do exactly that, to think about ways in which strategies that have been successful can be used on a trial basis and implemented other places. And even thinking about this talk, I really wanted to participate because I was also curious about how to think through this concept of resilience related specifically to the Caribbean, which is something that I'm still thinking about.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that Diana participates in Grandma's Garden. One of the things that she's done is she's creating art while we're having discussions. So it's interesting for a museum professional to slip into her artist's head because the discussions are difficult. Most of the places we're talking, people we've spoken to, or the places we discuss, she's already been to, but it's still a tough thing. So she started doing art. Now other people are doing art. They're self-healing. These are, farmers and museum professionals are in the process of self-healing during the discussions, but I think it's remarkable. And I had a question for you. What made you think about resilience, Michelle? What made you write so extensively about it?
When I had that interview in 2015, I was immediately struck by the sort of almost like the reproach, the remove of the person who answered me. And I wanted to include it in some of the videos that we were showing at the museum. It wasn't something that got included. And so, when something is left on the sort of like the cutting block like that, it sticks with you even more, because you start thinking about, well, if we didn't include it in the video or what we initially planned, what could I do with it? And I think as the years rolled on, particularly as we went into 2020, you just could not escape that word. It was on every newspaper and every headline, even now on all the commercials about post-COVID, and even about after the murder of George Floyd in the US, thinking about, this reckoning with race. Resilience comes up in both of these things. And I was doing a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where in the architecture and design community, it's also this kind of big buzzword, resilience and sustainability. And so I felt like there were all these ways in which it was intersecting in my own life. And then on the personal front, dealing with, health challenges within my family, dealing with communities that have to recover from so much trauma. I also felt like it was something that I needed to personally grapple with. And I felt that if I was probably going through that, I was not the only one. And so then I started reaching out to colleagues to kind of get their understanding with it. So it was many forces intersecting, and it has been quite fruitful. But, even when I'm watching Jeopardy or the news now, it's like, it's just there. So I think there's still more work to be done. And there are a lot of people that are speaking about this. So I think that it's timely as well.
Thank
I have a
you.
question.
I just, there's one more, there's a couple of questions that we wanted to get. One of the questions is, I'd like to see the resilience model from the first presentation again, please. It flashed on and off quickly, and I didn't get a chance to really look at it properly. I'm just going to mention that, these presentations are going to be available to folks who are registered for the conference for, I believe it's is it a month or 6 months?
6 months. 6 months.
So you'll get a chance to look at them again. And then there was a second one, another one saying, I'm also interested in a link to Grandma's Gardens. So we'll have to send a link, or Camila, maybe offline. I understand that there's a place where we can have a conversation offline. You'll have to leave your email, because it is an ongoing project.
Yes.
So
I had a
Okay, so
question. Can I ask one question of Diana and Michelle? This is a quick one. As both Black and Caribbean women, do you feel, well, I'm asking you, do you feel this double burden of resilience, the mantle of resilience through your culture and your race? I think being here in the United States, you have a lot of expectations on you. What are your thoughts? Either one.
Yeah, you want to go first?
No, Diana, why don't you go first, Diana?
Wow. Well, I think it's really interesting because, I spent my first 5 years in Bermuda, and then came to the States, and then was like kind of a barrel, going back and forth. But I think that there is the importance of staying within the family, being exposed to so many different codes to switch to, and that can be difficult. I remember when I was a kid, it was very difficult for me to situate myself. African American, but I'm Caribbean, and I have one culture at home and one culture at school, and another culture at school, and another culture in the work, in the workplace, and navigating between these worlds, and requires a different kind of a resilience. And probably the reason why I became an anthropologist is just trying to figure it out. And as you say, for me, making was very important, as a way to heal, to do therapy, and also because it was something that I learned from my elders, it kept things grounded. Yeah. What about you, Michelle?
Yeah, I think about that. I think I want to reject the burden, because I do think there's certainly an expectation, if not a burden. And I want to reject the idea that it's a burden. But as you saw, some of the images that I sort of used to help illustrate some of the concepts have women sort of holding something above their heads. And I do think about that iconography a lot. And, there's a way in which it can be kind of regal, but there's also, the question of like, how long can you sustain holding something up? And so I want to be able to embrace the strength that is there, but also have boundaries around it, right? And understand where someone's expectation of my strength does not mean that I have to perform in a way that is going to be a detriment to my well-being long-term. And I think, the conversations around self-preservation and self-care have been instrumental in people beginning to question, these labels that are powerful and sometimes that we welcome, but then also sometimes have this underside. And so I think it's important to have that conversation about the underside and understand the complexity, because it's something to embrace, but also something to be weary of when it's being imposed upon you by forces that are not always benevolent.
Oh, yeah, no, that's true. It's there's also, there's the 3 R's. There's reckoning, resilience, and respite. And respite is really important.
Thank you so much, ladies. Our strong, resilient Black ladies. And so that concludes this session. Of course, participants, if you need to speak to Diana, Camila, or Michelle, if you still feel that you like asking more questions or connecting with them, feel free to click on the networking menu on the left-hand side of your screen, where you can scroll through the list of attendees and presenters and start a conversation with them. Stay tuned. Our next session, another mix and sip. You learn to make more Caribbean cocktails. And this is with Verve Creations, our mix and sip, which starts at 3:30. So in about half an hour's time.
Thank you.
Ladies, thank you so much. You've been great.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Good night.